Hello, 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 and welcome back to Changing the Story, Kick-Ass Women in Business. It is your host, Lana Dingwall. Today, we're all in for a treat, but I think that I in particular am in for the treat because I get to do the conversation live. But today we are speaking with Gay Hendricks, who I'm sure if you listen to the podcast regularly, you've heard me speak of. He is the brains and the author behind the book, The Big Leap, which is a book that I always recommend to, pretty much anyone that will listen, but I recommend all the time to my clients, especially when you're in this situation of getting trapped in doing what you're good at, but it's not necessarily your zone of genius, your zone of brilliance. And The Big Leap is really talking about how to take that really scary jump into your zone of genius. And who better to talk about that than the zone of genius man himself. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Gay, and I'd love for you to even just introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I'm a psychologist by training. I got my doctorate in counseling psychology from Stanford way back before you were born, probably in 1974. And I became a university professor in the counseling psychology department at the University of Colorado, and I did that for 21 years. And then my wife and I wrote a book called Conscious Loving, and got a call one day from an up-and-coming young talk show host with an unusual name, Oprah Winfrey, and we said, "Who's this again?" And because we didn't watch much TV at the time, and but we were very happy to go out to Chicago and appear on her show in the early 90s, and kind of overnight, Conscious Loving became a big bestseller and has continued to be a bestseller for 30 years. And we live in the same general vicinity as Oprah here. So I'm going to send her a telepathic bow across the hill to where she lives there for appreciation. So we began teaching relationship seminars back in the 80s. And then after Conscious Loving came out, we kind of went into a whirlwind of about 10 or 15 years of, I think we went around the world 30 some times teaching relationship seminars all over the world and all sorts of different places. And so we developed a seminar series that took people through learning how to be in relationship themselves in a better way, and also then training coaches to do that with other people. And so we spend about half our time training other professionals to do relationship therapy or our form of body-mind therapy. And we then spend the other half of our time writing books and doing things like that. My wife and I, Katie, she and I have been together now 40 years, 40. And so we have developed all of our work together and kind of lived and worked together for the past 40 years. And so that's it's made for a fabulous life. And now I get to spend all my time in my zone of genius.
That's a great place to be. And because we were just talking about this before we hit record, and I want to mention at the beginning of the show and then also at the end, you also just released another book this week that it's called Conscious Luck, and it's all about 8 ways to increase your fortune consciously. So also congratulations on that.
Thank you. Here it is. Yes, just hot off the press, and happy that we just hit #1 in new releases last night in our category. And so we're delighted to get it. You know, as you probably know, producing a podcast or writing a book is kind of like giving birth in a way, I think, because you have to gestate the idea for a long time. And then finally, when it comes out in the world, you kind of go, and then you don't have any control over it anymore. But we are really happy to have this new one out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy. I think that's often how I frame business. It's the same concept, right? You have to birth and create these ideas, which is why we can have so much resistance around it. And I think that's a perfect segue into staying in your kind of zone of being really good at something versus your zone of genius. Is a lot of the times the thing that is our zone of genius is so much a part of us. It is something that we create, something that we look to birth. And so it can be so scary to release it out into the world, whereas staying in that zone of just doing something that we're good at, it feels safer, and we get a lot of validation, we get a lot of congratulations from it. So could you even maybe explain to us a little bit about like that process to you, what that means to you, or really anything, because again, you're the expert on this topic. So
Yes. Well, when I began to look into this, I was working with a lot of really smart people who were in the early Silicon Valley businesses like Intel and that kind of thing. And that was when I was still at Stanford after I got my PhD. I stayed on there for a year. And so I was working with these really brilliant people, but they were having more and more problems in their home life because they would have a big win at work and then they'd go home and get into a huge fight with their spouse or their partner or their kids or something, or they do it the other way around. Things would be going well at home and then they'd have some kind of giant hassle at work. And I begin to call this the upper limit problem. And I begin to look into different people's lives and into my own life, and I found that I often did the same thing. I would get along well with my then girlfriend, and then something would happen, we'd create an argument, and then it would take us several weeks to kind of get back in the groove again. And so, and also I was overweight at the time, and I would start to lose weight, and I would be on a nice diet and I'd lose 5 or 10 pounds, and then I'd go out and sabotage it by eating a couple of quarts of ice cream or something. And so I started calling this the upper limit problem. And so part of the big leap is all about how to unhook your upper limit problem so you're not limited by that anymore. And they're all grounded in fear. All upper limits problems come out of fear. And once you learn how to be with your fear and explore your fear instead of shutting it out, you get a whole new source of a way of having energy in your life, but it also releases those old limiting beliefs. In the Big Leap, too, it's also about another thing, which at the time I called the zone of genius. I call it the genius spiral now because a spiral is more open-ended. But I pointed out in the Big Leap that we usually occupy 4 different zones inside ourselves. Sometimes we're doing things that we're incompetent at, but we just haven't figured out any other better way to get them done. Some things we're in the zone of competence with, where we're doing things that we're good at, but somebody else could do just as well. A lot of times we're in our zone of excellence, where we're doing something we're really good at and people reward us for it, but we know it's not that thing we really want to be doing. When I was a university professor, I loved it in a way, but it was so frustrating because 90% of my time was spent doing stuff that wasn't really involved with teaching, or you get involved, you have to do all these committee meetings and everything like that. And so bottom line, I was spending like 6 or 10 hours a week with the very students I wanted to be spending 30 hours a week with, but it's not set up that way. So I found it very frustrating. So I decided to retire early when I was only 50 years old. And there wasn't any reward for early retirement. I just decided to quit. And what I decided to do, I said, I'm going to start a university that only teaches what people really need to know. It doesn't have any grades. There's no statistics classes you have to take or anything like that that are, painful things you want. But we're going to talk about what's essential and how to help people in the most essential ways. So that's basically what Katie and I have been doing at the Hendricks Institute over the past 30 years since I left the university. So we kind of created our own graduate program. Most of the people that come to us are professionals or people who are interested in relationship in one way or the other, some from the realm of business, some from medical, that kind of thing.
You said a lot of really great things there. So I'm gonna kind of play off of some of them. First, I love that you've renamed it the genius spiral, because I can picture this beautiful upward motion where the idea is it's limitless. And it really is just about seeing how far you can go, because you never know. And the more that you fall into that zone of genius, the more that you uncover.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. I'll tell you also, the image itself came from a moment in my life when Katie and I got married 40 years ago. We had a public wedding for friends and things, but we also hiked up to the top of a mountain in Colorado and had our own private, just the two of us, wedding where we said our vows to each other on this mountaintop. And as we were doing that, Katie said, "Oh, look up." And I looked up, and there was this beautiful hawk flying around in a spiral above our heads. And the wind currents were such that the hawk looked absolutely effortless, didn't even have to move its wings. And we said, let's make that a metaphor for how easy our relationship can be. Let's spread our wings, but really let the winds support us in going where they need to take us. And so we were saying our vows to each other with this hawk above. And then at the end, when we finished our vows, we looked up again and there were two hawks
Oh, that's cool.
flying around in this beautiful spiral above our heads. Oh my gosh, I can remember that moment like it was yesterday. And so later on, after the big leap came out, and I called it the zone of genius, one day I was working with a client here, an executive CEO of a company. And so she said something about the zone of genius. And this image came to my mind of the spiral. I said, for you, let's call it a spiral, because a spiral is open-ended and there's no end to your genius. And so she said, she kind of lit up. And so from then on, we've kind of been talking about the spiral. But it's really the same thing in a way, because whether you call it the zone or a spiral, what it's really about is doing what you most love to do. And when I first woke up to that idea 30 years ago, I figured out that I was only spending 10% of my time doing what I most love to do.
Mm.
That shocked me when I actually counted it up, and I realized, wow, I've created this amazing life and now I'm not doing what I love to do. And
Yeah.
I'd set out, you go through, it takes a lot of work to get a doctorate from Stanford. I had to sweat it out for 3 years, and just to get to the point then when I could start my private practice and that kind of thing. And then to end up doing a lot of paperwork and stuff, it just drove me nuts. So anyway, I got gradually more and more frustrated with that and started working on just doing things that I most love to do. And I started doing more and more of those. And then suddenly one day, 20 years ago, I woke up and realized, wow, I'm doing 90% of my time in my zone of genius, on the genius spiral now, and only 10% of my time doing other stuff that I don't, that's not in my genius. Like I eat lunch, I go to sleep, I drive from place to place. That's not exactly in my genius, but I have to do it in order to
Yeah.
practice my genius. So that's what I do in the other 10% of my time.
That's cool. I think even with what the idea of the spiral is an endless spiral is the complete opposite of the upper limit. So with the upper limit, we can get trapped because we think that we are living life to the fullest. We think that we've got the good career, often the good life, mostly because we're getting usually a lot of external validation from people telling us how accomplished and successful we are, but we are hitting up against that limit. And with the idea with the spiral and being in the zone of this spiral and it being limitless, is you should really never feel like you're actually hitting the ceiling. Like you should always be in a place where there could be more possibility. There could be more things to explore, more things to learn, more potential. So I really love the idea of the spiral, especially in relation to the upper limit, which is obviously quite limiting. When you were talking about realizing that you were spending so much time doing not the things that you loved and really only spending around 10% doing the things in your zone of genius or doing the things that you love. I know a lot of people feel that way, especially in our businesses. We almost feel that we're not allowed to exist in a world where we get to do 90% of what makes us come alive and only do 10% of the other types of administrative things. How were you able to lean into that concept or that idea when we do live in a culture and a society that really does tell us that just being able to stomach what you do for work is good enough?
That's a really powerful statement. I'd never really seen it that way, but that's really true. I appreciate you're bringing the stomach aspect of it in it, because I think it is making a lot of people sick.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at the current rising cost of medicines and treatment and that kind of thing, more and more people are getting sicker and sicker by their lifestyle. And, there was a great quotation from the philosopher Blaise Pascal a couple of hundred years ago. He said that all of our problems as human beings come from not being able to sit in a room by ourselves for 10 minutes doing nothing. And so I think what he was getting at is underneath the problem that we're talking about right now, because it only takes a few minutes to, like when executives come here or people come here, we have them go in a room for only 10 minutes at first and just ask themselves, what is my true genius? Or, what do I most love to do? And we have them do that for just 10 minutes because we know it's not going to take any longer. And it happens to fit Blaise Pascal's quotation too, because how many times as a human being in your life has somebody asked you to go in a room for 10 minutes and focus exclusively on what you most love to do? Wouldn't that have been great to do in the first grade or the sixth grade or when I was in college? Or, I think that our own creative depths bring up more fear oftentimes than anything in the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
I know that a lot of people are afraid of public speaking. As a matter of fact, when I wrote my first book in 1975, I went out on the lecture circuit and started giving talks about it. And a guy came up to me after my first big public presentation, and he said, I really loved your talk. And I said, oh, great, thank you. And he said, it wasn't exactly what you said, it was how you said it. And I said, oh, what do you mean? And he said, your voice shakes just as badly as mine does when I try to give a public speech, Okay, thank you very much, But it was true, because and so the fear of public speaking is a huge fear, the fear of death, the fear of lots of different things. But I think people really fear going down inside and uncovering their true genius because they're not sure what they can do with it if they do. And, there's a great quotation that I put in my book, The Joy of Genius, which is a follow-up. It's a small book that illustrates a particular point that I didn't get to in the Big Leap. And the point is basically that you get to creative energy by letting go of trying to control things you don't have any control over. So the moment you let go of control, for example, let go of trying to control what other people think of you, suddenly you uncover the very thing inside that will make them attracted to you. And so that principle, I quoted, there's a book in one of the apocryphal gospels, that is one of the books that didn't make it into the official Bible, and it's called the Gospel of Thomas, and it has some amazing things in it. And one of the things it says is, if you bring forth what is within you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. And I've seen now, I think about 20-some thousand people as individuals or in seminars and about 4,500 couples. And I can tell you without hesitation that that's absolutely right. Because if people don't bring forth whatever it is they're holding inside, it makes them unhappy and can ultimately make them sick. We had a fellow here who had back pain that he was thinking about getting surgery for, and he came to us from another country and with his wife, and he'd been having this back pain for 3 years. And during that 3 years, he'd had something like 175 chiropractic adjustments and 100 massages, and he'd done everything, and he was on the verge of getting whatever it is that spinal fusion surgery is, where they lock your spine into place. And so he decided to have one last chance. And so our treatment actually probably took about 10 minutes. I say that underneath every problem is a 10-minute sweaty conversation that you're trying to avoid. And his sweaty conversation was, honey, for the last 3 years, I haven't been going to Kiwanis Club on Tuesday. I've been having sex at a hotel with my secretary. Sweaty conversation? Yes. But guess what happened after it? His back pain disappeared. And his wife, of course, got understandably very upset. They were eventually able to work that out and are still thriving now. But look at the pain he had to go through just to get to that 10-minute sweaty conversation. I want us to get better at saying the thing that is within us. Or like we talked about the genius spiral. When we open up and get on the genius spiral, a lot of our other issues disappear. because that's what we've been wanting to have happen in our lives.
Mm.
One reason that Katie and I get along so well is in our very first conversation, we kind of agreed that we both, in a relationship, it was sacred for us, our own creative path. I'm a writer, and I go in a room for 2 or 3 hours by myself every day. And if that's not okay with my partner, that's going to cause a lot of real friction. And that's been a problem before I met Katie. I was in other relationships with people who weren't necessarily a creative kind of person. And so they resented me disappearing for 2 or 3 hours every day. And so for me, though, I got to do it. That's how I do my craft. And so I find a way now that in a relationship where both of us support each other's creativity is really eliminates a lot of conflict.
Yes. You said a lot of really good things in there that as soon as I get the recording for this, I'm going to go back and listen to.
I'll come back and answer those, okay?
Okay, perfect. I appreciate that. One of the things too, you spoke to
I've
it a few
been up
times.
since 4:30, so forgive me an occasional swig on my coffee thermos here.
Oh, please, no. You do you. One of the things you were talking about with, the sweaty conversation, but then also the control that we have around creativity, the fears we have around actually taking our genius and creating something with it. It kept echoing this same theme, which is that we spend so much of our very limited bandwidth trying so hard to avoid being vulnerable that it actually makes us more vulnerable.
See, I think you're onto something really important there. By the way, I can't tell from my age vantage point whether you're a 25-year-old or a 35-year-old or a 19-year-old or what. Everybody sort of looks like a teenager under about the age of 40. But are you in your 20s or 30s?
30s.
Okay, that's perfect in a way, because the point I want to illustrate, in your 30s, you have a different developmental task than you had in your 20s and are going to have in your 40s. I used to teach a course on cable TV about developmental psychology when I was in Colorado, and I taught it in decades. I would look at what goes on in the 20s psychologically, what goes on in the 30s. In relationships, for example, in your 20s, your job is really to experiment, learn about yourself, try to find out about how to be with other people and that kind of thing. We say in your 20s, you experiment. In your 30s, you find your life. In your 40s, you build your life. In your 50s, you enjoy your life. I hope you enjoy it now, but it's just
Yes.
in general, people tend to find themselves really in their 30s. They find out what they most love to do, and they find out all about their different feelings they have and how to communicate those and be in integrity with yourself and be in relationship at the same time. Those are very powerful things to learn in your 30s. Now, many of your listeners probably will be in their 40s, 50s, and older too. And each of those have their own developmental questions. Like in your 40s, it's a lot about making sure you keep your work in such a way that you can maintain your passion with it. Because I've worked with, I would estimate, at least 100 people who were high-powered professionals, doctors, lawyers, CPAs, that come in, and here's the basic conversation they have with me. They say, I'm 43 years old. I'm making my $400,000 a year. My wife and family loves being in the right country club. They love flying first class. But I feel like if I keep doing this, I'm going to kill myself.
Mm.
And the reason that's happening is because somewhere along the line, they've gotten seduced over into more and more things that are in their zone of excellence, and they're neglecting things that are on the genius spiral.
Mm.
That's really important. So if you're listening to this in your 40s, make sure you're gravitating toward the things that you feel passionate about. Because what happens in your 50s, we say every breath you take after 50 is a choice between creativity or stagnation. Creativity or stagnation. Which breath are you going to take? Are you going to breathe for your creativity, or are you going to kind of not breathe and slide further into stagnation? It's a big issue. So obviously I'm a cheerleader for creativity, and I'm a cheerleader for finding out what you most love to do. Because here in my office, I've gotten to see the other side of that when people neglect that, and then they come in and they're 55 years old and maybe they're making pretty good money, but they're feeling miserable inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we need to find a way to make our work a work of the heart as well as a work of the mind if we're really going to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the world doesn't need more people who just do what they're good at. The world needs people who come alive through the work that they do, because that type of energy and inspiration and empowerment that we feel when we're around people who feel so in alignment with their work, like that, there's nothing better than that. And that energy, right, it ripples out into other people. And the world definitely needs more Gay Hendricks in it.
Well, thank you. Well, it's important to apply yourself in life and find what you most love to do. One of my great teachers, Krishnamurti, spiritual teacher Jay Krishnamurti, way back, I was at a lecture, and he said the sole purpose of education is to find out with all your heart what you most love to do.
Mm.
And I think that expresses exactly how I feel. And that doesn't have to start when you're 20 or stop when you're 80. You know, I've had couples in this room that one of them might be 75 years old, the other one's 73-year-old, and they're here to work on their relationship and have more love and excitement in their life. And I really honor that, because it's never too late to open up to doing more of what you love to do.
Mm-hmm. My question to you would be, for a lot of people, I know they want to open themselves up to what they love doing. And they hear it from me all the time. I tell people all the time, it's really about finding what makes you come alive. It's about doing work that fuels your sense of purpose in this world and operating in that spiral of genius. Time and time again, though, the big resistance block, the reason people will accept hitting up against their upper limit over and over and over again, even though they know consciously there's a space for them to live in even more possibility, they get trapped in this concept of responsibility. They get trapped in this concept of, how am I allowed to do the work that makes me come alive when I'm told that it really is just about, again, doing work that pays me a lot of money, that gives me the validation. And it can be very seductive when we are in our zone of excellence. It's very seductive to stay there. What would be your piece of advice, or something that you really use to help people who they want to make it into the spiral, the zone of genius? They can see it, but they're too seduced by their zone of excellence.
Yes, and that's exactly where I often end up working with people when they come here, when we come, because oftentimes people don't get really motivated to seek out change until they've been sitting on a hot stove for a long time, and then they say, I can't do that anymore. And so here's the thing. Every change process in life has to begin with 1 second of willingness. So the very first thing, if a person is really stuck in that place of being afraid, I ask them first, would you be willing? Would you just be willing to open up for a second to being willing to living in your genius more? And sometimes they won't even do that. You know, they're very committed. You know, I'm afraid to do that. Like I said, sometimes the fear of going down in here is scarier than jumping off a 500-foot diving board. As a matter of fact, one time I invited a man who was, he'd been an airline pilot, but then he inherited a lot of money and he was kind of seeking what he was supposed to do in his 50s. And so I was working with him and I began to kind of help him tune in inside. And he got very nervous doing it. He got very scared of doing it. And I said, okay, well, we don't have to do it all right now. So next session, we'll pick it up. So I got a call from him later that he was out on the beach walking around near where he lived, and he was trying to do what I had been telling him to do, and he had gotten scared. And so he called me up, and my answering service got hold of me and said, you have an emergency call. And so I talked to him, and here's what he told me. He told me he was kind of having an anxiety attack, and I asked him, did it remind him of anything else? And he said, no, this is really scary. And then he said, I've crashed 2 airplanes, and that was sort of scary, but this is really scary. I mean, that just pinned my ears back, because for me, being in an airplane crash would be way scarier than taking a few breaths and opening up to my inner being, But that just goes to show you that a lot of times we've been so programmed not to trust inside and not to go inside that it brings up anxiety. But that's where breathing comes in. I talk a lot in my books about the importance of your natural body wisdom, things like breathing and natural movement and that kind of thing, because when you're scared, the very best thing you can do is the thing that people don't do. A lot of times when people get scared, they hold their breath, and try to make the fear go away. But actually, the only way to make the fear go away is take some easy breaths. And so you kind of have to go the opposite direction a lot of times of the tendency of the old fight or flight move, but to just take some easy breaths. We always say the best advice is to always start by taking 3 easy breaths and changing your body position. Because when you're stuck, the tendency is to kind of freeze your muscles and tighten up everything.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of, which we talk about a lot on the show, the Buddhist concept of how we have a tendency sometimes to close ourselves off. And in reality, and we close ourselves off because we think we're protecting ourselves, because we are so afraid of being vulnerable, because going deep, going in is really, really scary. So we'll kind of shut down. And the concept in Buddhism is, what if the absolute bravest thing that you could ever do would be to open yourself up, would be to give something your absolute all without any guarantee or attachment to having to succeed. And I think for me, that when you're talking about willingness, that's what I think about. You just have to be willing to recognize that, as you said, sitting on the stove about to combust is not really living. And what if the bravest thing that you can do is just believe a little bit, to take that jump over into your spiral, your zone of being a genius.
Yeah, and it's a gift to yourself, and it's a gift to the people around you, because also the more you open up to your genius, the more you get on the genius spiral, the less you get interested in the kind of the petty dramas of life. What other people are thinking about you, what other people are saying, all that kind of stuff. It kind of disappears once you kind of uncover your own mission. And I've been an entrepreneur myself since I was in the 5th grade. I created a little business when I was in the 5th grade. I've always loved to set up things, and I set up a little business, watermelon business, and I bought 4 watermelons from Mr. Lewin, who lived next door, who was a watermelon merchant, and I took them down to the roadside in Florida where I live on a very hot summer day, and I would hold up these watermelons by the side of the road to sell to passing cars. And I stood down there for hours holding up watermelons, and nobody stopped. And so I had to haul the watermelons all the way back up the hill. The next day, I had an entrepreneurial idea. Hey, nobody's going to buy a whole watermelon, but what if I sliced it 8 ways, and instead of selling the whole watermelon for a quarter, see, I bought them for 15 cents and I was going to sell them for a quarter, but what if I sliced them in 8, sell them for a nickel? I got 40 cents a watermelon. I'm rich, And so I took my 4 watermelons back down the next day and carefully sliced up one. Whoosh, I sold out in about 20 minutes. Sliced up another one. Whoosh, sold out. By the end of the day, I'd gone back and forth up the hill so many times for more watermelons. I was exhausted, but I had $3.75 worth of nickels. And that to me was like the fortune, because for a 10-year-old in Leesburg, Florida, and that was really a breakthrough. So we all probably have an initial entrepreneuring story, but there's something about entrepreneuring that to me is absolutely the very best thing. When you make something out of nothing and then get other people interested in it, I mean, to me, that's life at its best in the business world.
It is. And I think your story is this perfect example of how you might have this really great idea and your first attempt at executing it might not go according to plan. And some of us, that's when we ditch the idea. Oh, it was just a stupid idea to begin with. It feels too scary to accept the idea that maybe we do have a good idea. It's just going to take more work than we originally thought. And it can be something as simple as changing your perspective, looking at it from your client's perspective. And as you said, just going back and cutting up the watermelon and selling out, and ended up making more money than you thought you would through your initial plan. So I do think that that's a really great overarching analogy too for entrepreneurship and a good idea. Sometimes it just takes a few different attempts to finally get that one little thing that you're missing.
Yeah, you kind of have to be, well, when my daughter was little, she had this Bobo the Clown thing, which was this clown about the size of her, but it had a weight in the bottom, and you could biff the clown and it would go over and then pop right back up, and biff it and it would pop right back up. In a way, an entrepreneur has to be like a Bobo the Clown, because there's always going to be these things. Like I was just on a conference call the other day with a guy that up until the pandemic happened, he had 200 people sitting there in offices in Manhattan engaged in a project that absolutely came to a halt that day, and wow, what do you do in a situation like that? That's a Bobo the Clown moment to the max.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And I used to play with Bobo the Clown. Quite fun.
Oh, did you? I don't think it was invented when I was a kid. I would have had one for sure.
It's so much fun. But again, it's the same thing. It's the idea it can take a hit and it always comes back up. There's a Japanese proverb. It's like get knocked down 7, get up 8. It's the commitment. And when you are, and this is the allure of actually operating from your like spiraling in your genius, is it's really easy to take a punch and get back up when you're in that genius space, because even to go to your eagle analogy, your perspective is so high. You can see the whole picture. You understand how all these little pieces connect. So having a failure or being knocked down in one area doesn't feel so defeating because you do have that higher perspective. You do have that higher understanding. You recognize that while you might not get why you just got knocked down, it will play its part in a bigger plan in the future. And that you can't always experience that when you're in your zone of excellence, because I feel at least, so much of your identity is tied up in your titles or your successes, because that's what you're giving up. You're giving up the space to feel like you get to do 90% of what makes you come alive. You're giving that up for your success, for your wins. And so when those start to get taken away, it can feel very ungrounding.
I agree. And so that's why we need to kind of work overtime in a benign, easygoing way to make sure that we're not wandering too far off of our central mission. In the Big Leap, I put in there what my personal mission is, which has to do with I expand every day in love, creativity, and abundance as I inspire other people to do the same. Because for me, life is not complete, really. I like to teach what I know, and I like to see people's faces light up when they suddenly understand something that makes a difference in their lives. That to me is like the essence of good living. But whatever your life mission is, your central key core mission is, if you wander too far off of it, we start making ourselves sick, or we start having accidents, or we start creating grief in our personal relationships. We don't need to always be on our right in harmony with our mission, but we just need to correct when we've wandered too far off. I always compare it to being like the automatic pilot of an aircraft, that an aircraft can take off in Ottawa and fly off toward Los Angeles, and it sets the autopilot for Los Angeles, and then if it drifts off, it says, hey, we're drifting to the right, correct, and it comes back and drifts off, hey, we're drifting to the left, correct, correct, correct. So it is willing to make little adjustments to stay on track. And as a result, it gets all the way from Ottawa to LA by being wrong most of the time because it's willing to correct. And it doesn't wait till we've wandered way off toward Anchorage, Alaska before it corrects. It makes a little tiny correction when it moves toward Fresno or moves toward, just a little bit off center. So the point I'm making that it's openness to learning and willingness to make little corrections that are an entrepreneur's best friend. That if you get open to learning, it opens you up. We have a metaphor we use in conscious luck, that luck is like the wind, that it's always there. It's not a lightning strike or like a lottery win. Luck is always there, blowing, moving, and our job is to open up our sails to it so we catch the wind and ride effortlessly on it. And in Conscious Luck, we talk about 8 different ways to do that. But in one way or the other, your luck and your genius are very related because they all have to do with learning how to find out what you really most love to do and how to correct when you've moved out of that zone.
Well, this is the perfect segue because I wanted my next question or volley over to you to be about conscious luck. So if we even look at you kind of speaking about it from the perspective of when you gave your introduction as an example, you talked about how you had a phone call from this woman that obviously none of us have ever heard of, Oprah Winfrey, and actually were on her show. And a lot of people would see that as your quote unquote, your big break. And a lot of people might chalk that experience up to luck, which I know, is not how it panned out. But so when we look at it like that, because there's a lot of people who think, oh, well, it's really easy to operate in your zone of genius after you've gotten your big break, after you've had that lightning struck of luck. So for people who kind of get stuck in that space of thinking they're just waiting for their lucky break, how does some of the things you've talked about in conscious luck apply to that notion that really your wind analogy was a beautiful example, how it's really just about opening up your sails. It always exists. It's always there, just waiting for you. You really have to take that leap and be open to it.
Yes, great question. Well, I think that most people, what we need to do is keep homing in on that thing they most love to do. That has an energy of its own that allows you then more to confront the things that come at you, the barriers that come up. And so I think that that's where we need to put our full attention, because if we put our attention on anything outside ourselves, like getting our big break or anything like that, we're really kind of putting the cart before the horse, as the old saying goes. I say, find that thing you love to do and would do 28 hours a day, even if you weren't getting paid for it. And then you will start getting paid for it more and more and more. And then good breaks will start to happen. It doesn't go the other way around. Like for years before we got invited to go on Oprah, we were doing work with 6 couples at a time in our living room, just night after night, week after week, working on things like that. And so, and my wife was in full-time private practice, so she worked with people almost 40 hours a week. And so we put in a lot of time doing that before our big break happened, but it was all based on doing more and more of what we most love to do. I think that in life in general, we put far too much attention on the outer and far too little attention on the inner. And that's why we get so out of whack in a way, because people get up into their 30s, 40s, and 50s and realize they don't really have an inner life very much. And so that's a serious problem, because like I said, anytime you get after 50 or so, you're making choices every day between creativity and stagnation. And stagnation, once you lock into it, is very hard to unlock yourself out of it.
Mm-hmm. I loved what you said too. I've never thought of it from this perspective, but obviously it makes so much sense that the idea of what makes you come alive has this really strong vibrational, energetic pull to it, but it also has a really strong vibration. And the idea being it's going to be different for everyone. So what makes me come alive is going to be different than you. What your spiral zone of genius is going to be different than mine. But it really is about recognizing that when we step into whatever that is for us, the energy around us shifts and changes. And I'm sure, much like with what you were explaining with your wife and how many hours she was putting into the work before you guys got onto Oprah, a lot of it is different work feels differently. So when you're operating in this space of doing things that feel in alignment with you and make you come alive, it doesn't always feel like you're giving out the same amount of energy as you are when you're doing something that drains you, something that you don't like. And that really in of itself is the allure to operating in this genius spiral area versus your upper limit or your zone of excellence. Because often the things that we're good at, we're just good at them, but they don't actually fuel us. They don't give us energy. They just take energy from us. With you, you guys are still doing this work, and you've been doing this work for 40 years, as you've been talking about. Do you feel, and I obviously feel like I know the answer to this question, but how has operating in this genius spiral led it to not only where you and your wife have this really happy, thriving relationship, just as a couple has been together for a very long time, but also where you worked together and you're still doing this work? And obviously it's changed and it's adapted, but how does that energy feel different to you where it just keeps fueling your creation of more? As in, even this week, you just released another brilliant book.
Yes, well, I think that once you lock in and get your life energy on the line, get your what you most love to do on the line, it has a self-generating energy. That's been my experience of it. And so, honestly, at this very moment, I feel just as excited and passionate about what I'm talking about as when I first started talking about it 40 years ago. And same thing in my relationship with Katie. I'm absolutely blown away every day of my life that I get to be married to her.
Mm.
And somebody at one of our seminars got out their calculator and figured out that we'd spent 14,500 days together. And for me, that's 14,500 days of waking up every day feeling like the luckiest man alive because I get to be married to Gay Hendricks, also known as Katie. And so I think that what we need to do is focus on finding that thing inside that you love to do. And then, of course, in relationship, if you can possibly find a person that resonates with that, that's so much the better in life, because then you get to have a playmate. But whether or not you end up with a playmate or not, you got to learn to have your own self be your best playmate, because that, to me, the keeping the kind of the twinkle of creativity alive in ourselves is the key thing. Because if we lose that, that sparkle goes out of our eyes, that singing goes out of our heart. When that happens, it's hard to think of yourself as very lucky. I have one other thing to say. I see I'm getting flagged to disappear here and go to another interview here in 3 minutes. But let me just say one thing here, that when we at our seminars, we give people a little silicone band at the end if they want one, and it says 3 things on it. It says breathe, move, love. And what we mean by that is, in life, you're going to be stuck many times. You're going to be in a traffic jam, literally, as well as a traffic jam up here, and you can't find your way out. What do? Well, first we say, take a breath. Wherever you are, just take a nice, big, easy breath. Number 2, breathe, move, love. Move your body around a little bit, because so many of us will sit in a desk for 4 hours and then say, why am I so tired? Why does my neck hurt? And so you need to keep yourself moving, because the essence of health, in our view, is circulation. The quality of things you circulate through your mind, the quality of things you circulate through your heart, and ultimately what you eat circulates through your blood. So you got to circulate high quality stuff, but you got to keep circulating, moving things around. And ultimately, love is the ultimate healer, because anything that you can love begins to shift in a key way. Like if you can love yourself for feeling scared of making that public speech, that fear begins to disappear. Or when you find yourself angry and you're getting a headache and you say, okay, what am I angry about? Oh, I see what I'm angry about. And you take a moment and breathe with that and love that. See, those are the moments that propel you forward in life toward a life with more and more and better luck. Because the moment you let go of those extraneous things, we've got inside all of the cosmic rhythms that the universe has because we are a part of the universe. And we need to acknowledge that. And so once you get that inner part of yourself as your own best playmate, the universe becomes your own best playmate, and the universe itself becomes the big game. How to move through that with grace and breathing, moving, and loving in a way that increases your ability to love yourself and others every day.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And that's a really great place to wrap it up on, because I know that you're in launch week. I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. As I said, I think you do incredible work, and I'm so thankful that you took that leap into operating and spiraling in that genius zone for you, because the world is a much better place, an inspired place because of it. And thank you so much for your time. And I'll be sure to put in the show notes a link to anyone that, if they want to grab your book, I will put a link into that into the show notes, and any other type of contact information if anyone wants to get a hold of you. Because, guys, we have to support people like Gay Hendricks. That's how he creates more magic in this world, is by us supporting him. And thank you so much for, obviously, all the listeners for taking time today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, review, share, spread the love, not just this episode, but any episode. And obviously, you need to do what I'm about to do, which is go into Amazon and buy Conscious Look. So keep kicking ass. You're doing way better than you think you are. And we will speak with you next week.
Thanks, Lana.